Hello! Welcome live from Washington, D.C. with a truly inspiring crew across the entire planet of illustrious guests joining us. We have guests from Estonia, we have guests from Switzerland, we have guests from Montreal, Quebec, and we also have guests here in D.C. itself to talk today about how we can achieve both healthy communities and economic renewal. This is clearly in the context of both COVID-19, but also thinking about other disruptions over the horizon and making sure that we increase the resilience of our communities to be both healthy and economically vibrant. I'm with the Atlantic Council as the director of the new GeoTech Center. The GeoTech Center focused on the geopolitics of new technology and data. We invite you, if you're watching us live today, to join us using the hashtag #GoodTechChoices, because we want to talk about what world leaders need to be thinking about as we strive to achieve both healthy communities and economic renewal. With that, I'd like to first turn to Philippe Gillet. And Philippe, I'd like to ask you, how can we actually use some important scientific and technological issues to get a hold of this, both this immediate crisis and the longer term issues to achieve both healthy communities and economic renewal?
Hello, everybody. So I'm Philippe Gillet. I'm the Chief Science Officer at SIGPA, and very happy to join this webinar. So for me, what is at stake in your question is more about acceptance and understanding. I think that it's not only about science and technology, it's also about social acceptability and ethics. The present crisis reveals, beside the weak coordination we all have and the resilience and the weak resilience so far, is fear from new tech in some quarters. While we do aim for security and privacy, preservation by design, and during such a crisis, we try to choose the best possible. We are aware that there are some risks, I would say many risks. And it is important, if we have to progress, that we don't let fear, global fears, prevent us from trying to prove the benefits of new technologies. That's, I think, a major point. If we inform, if we debate, if we test a small scale before producing, we can turn technologies into much more fair and acceptable solutions. I think this is something we should learn from this crisis. It also highlights, I believe, the complex situation between people and quick innovation. You see it for tests, for this coronavirus test. You see it in many other domains related to this crisis. But it also demonstrates, I think, our striving to do things better, the value of permanent innovation, the need for agility. Crises and wars, if we can make the comparison, because it has already been made by some politicians, are often a time for technical progress. And this is a necessity for us, and this is a necessity of innovation and invention today. Just as an example, the cell phone tracking apps in Europe, but I believe it's the case everywhere, were a no-go a few weeks ago. It was culturally unacceptable. What we see today is what would normally take 10 years of debate, another 10 years of implementation probably. This is now being trialed in weeks. In the end, it may not be adopted, but it is being tried at a very small scale. And I think this is something that is also today something which is unusual. After a trend to be, if you look to people, they were essentially anti-expert. We now have a public that is more or less eager for scientific insight. We are kept informed. We have a lot of information about the risks and the benefits of technologies, and media are playing a central role in that. But we look at every possible weak point in society to make sure that no one is discriminated. And I think discrimination is also something that is revealed. Discrimination by technology is also something that has been revealed very heavily during this crisis. All this put together, I think, should lead to innovation for the greater good. But we need to make sure that it is not stifled by fear. And in another way, we have a real opportunity to test acceptability, to share understandings, because technology is also a matter of understanding, to test the limits, to be dynamic. And when the pandemic is over, we could decide, I would say, globally or locally, which transition technologies or which, I would say, temporary measures are worth becoming permanent. And I think this is something I would also stress today. For example, is what you probably heard about the immunity COVID passport. Today, we think it's not ready to use. It is a good thing that can be turned into a digital vaccine passport or digital health passport applicable worldwide in the future. Nobody knows, maybe, but we need to try it, because it's time to try different solutions. So these were my 2 cents as an introduction to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. And what I like what you said about how we need to make sure we don't let fear paralyze us or hold us back. And at the same time, we recognize that we're in unprecedented territory. This is figuring out how we can get through this pandemic together, which is going to require us to do informed experiments involving the public, making sure they have their inputs. And the thing with experiments is they have the same root of the word experience and expertise, and that they come from the Greek word experia, meaning out of danger. Experiments will not always work out, but we have to figure out how we get through this crisis together, because this is unprecedented. With that said, I'd like to now turn to Mona. Mona, we are really honored and privileged that you were able to have time out of your very busy schedule. If you could real quick first introduce who you are, and then from that, I'd like to ask you the same question, which is, what are the important scientific and technological issues we need to consider here when trying to achieve both healthy communities and economic renewal?
Bonjour, good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. I'm Mona Nemer. I'm the Chief Science Advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet in Canada. So I think that the crisis has, I think, unveiled a lot of weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our systems and our lives. Certainly our inability, perhaps, to coordinate across the globe, across our large countries, and also across sectors between scientists, politicians, decision makers, and economists. I think there are many lessons learned, for sure. In terms of technology, I think it's clearly told us that internet is not a luxury, it's actually a utility, because imagine if we were in places that don't have internet, we wouldn't be able to be speaking with each other today. So I think that's a very important one. The second important one is about data and how we manage data and how we have to think about data stewardship, I think, ahead of time, and also have a sense of coordination again across the globe, because data doesn't stop at borders either. So I think the issues of data security and data privacy is extremely important. In terms of the health sector, the sector where I come from, I think our vulnerabilities are immense. Clearly, we don't have enough arsenal to combat viruses and new viral infections. So I think that we're learning in a accelerated time that things do take time, that when you have the infection is not the time to start looking for a drug or for a medical countermeasure to it. And if we don't have that arsenal, then there's going to be a very heavy price to be paid in terms of the economy, but also our own well-being. And I would say that the last, a very important issue to me in this crisis is about science literacy, and we can say science and technology literacy. And I think that a lot of the fear and a lot of the misinformation is due to the fact that we haven't paid enough attention to science and technological literacy in the public at large. You talked about experimenting, about the scientific method, and I think if that was well understood by the general public, I think we would be facing fewer issues right now in terms of the actions that governments are having to take.
Very well said. And I really appreciate, Mona, that one, you're emphasizing that, yes, the internet is now essential. I can't imagine trying to navigate through this crisis without it. Ham radio would have been very challenging. And I also like what you said, which is, while we right now, a lot of people are aware there's misinformation and disinformation around the pandemic, they haven't really pointed to solutions. And I think you probably have elevated one of the first ones, which is we need scientific and technological literacy. So thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to Lukas, who's joining us from Estonia. Lukas, if you could real quick introduce who you are, and with that as well, the same question, which is, what are the important scientific and technological issues we should consider to get through this together?
Thank you. So my name is Lukas Ilves. I'm head of strategy for Guardtime, which is the world's leading enterprise blockchain company with active deployments in a lot of sectors, including defense, healthcare, telecommunications, and so on. So I think Mona already touched on the fact that, first of all, we've got some immediate benefits of the digital revolution that we're all reaping right now. And imagine if we'd had the same type of lockdown 20 years ago, what impact that would have had on our economies. Now, the lockdown sort of gave us one dilemma, which was a choice between a robust public health response and closing down our economies and societies. There are some societies that managed to avoid that dilemma, and those were the countries that really were prepared for this because of their previous experience with SARS, for instance. So South Korea, Taiwan, and some other countries in Southeast Asia and Oceania have had pretty good responses, and the rest of us are catching up. Now, to catch up, we really need to use data. We need data, first of all, to understand what's going on, how this disease works, whether that's for developing vaccines and testing their efficacy, for understanding how immunity works, to do the nuts and bolts of contact tracing, to avoid some of the really labor-intensive forms of public health responses that, say, Taiwan was prepared to engage in. Contact tracing requires basically one contact tracing specialist per 4,000 people in your population, but we can bridge that gap by better use of data. And of course, we need applications that can use data in new and clever ways. And the promise of all of this is that we actually can get our economies going with new ways of sharing this data and analyzing it. But that gives us a new dilemma, which Philippe has already touched on, which is data protection versus all the benefits that a lot of these new applications and these uses of data give us. And it's not an academic dilemma. So for instance, the European Commission put out its recommendations on how to do contact tracing. And some of those recommendations included, don't make it mandatory, don't use location data. Now, those make sense from a data protection standpoint, but they also limit the efficacy of that same contact tracing, potentially. If you say have 15 to 20% adoption, which falls short of the 60% adoption that the experts say you need around contact tracing, you won't get the benefits of automated contact tracing. Or if you don't have location data, there's a whole bunch of epidemiological things you can't do. So we have this new set of trade-offs basically between the efficacy of what we would do with data versus data protection. And as Philippe said, in a regular circumstance, the data protection concerns might weigh out, especially in Europe. That balance may go differently now. And I'd like to offer one provoking thought for discussion here, which is that people are most worried about what is being called the new Patriot Act. And I would submit that, in a sense, democracies, at least, governments have been fairly good stewards of their citizens' data. Even the US, you would struggle to find specific cases of Patriot Act data having been abused in the context of how a democratic society functions, and the types of things you would care about when data is being shared, whether the data use is proportionate, whether purpose limitations are being followed, whether it's transparent. Those are things that governments that are bound by laws are able to deliver on. Rather, I'd be worried about two things in particular. One is how the private sector is going to engage with this data. And there's a usual concern about big internet companies, but there's also the fact that employers are going to be wanting to collect a lot of data about their employees' exposure to keep their employees and their customers safe and so on. I'm not saying they're the bad guys, but figuring out how we control and make that auditable is one challenge. And the other is what Mona already alluded to. We need to do this internationally. And while we may say, I trust the courts in Estonia or the courts in the US to safeguard my rights, both my data protection rights and potential misuse of that data that might arise, do I have the same confidence about how that data might be used in a lot of countries across the world? Now, that's a short-term question. I really quickly just want to point to some of the more medium-term issues, which is that basically this is a massive disruptive event. So all these trends in any domain, whether we're talking about trends in criminality and how cybercrime works, or we're talking about big geopolitical realignments that you can read about in pretty much any report you want to over the last 15, 20 years, they all have the chance to take off now. And so in a sense, there's a big moment of uncertainty. And what we get from talking with people who kind of watch, for instance, cybercrime space or state activity in cyberspace is that really all the different actors are trying to figure out what's going on, probing each other, and ready for very disruptive outcomes. And those could be positive outcomes. It could be that a lot of the digitization, for instance, of government, that as an Estonian, we've been trying to tell the world about for 20 years, and we've been frustrated how slowly the world moves, that picks up. But it may also be that some of the worries we've had around cybercrime, around the vulnerability of cloud, those also really pick up. So I'm hoping we can get into some of those many medium to long-term disruptions, both positive and negative, we might be facing.
Excellent. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. I do look forward to it. And I like what you said, which is maybe COVID-19 is an opportunity for governments that were not moving as fast as they could in terms of modernizing and moving to digital. Maybe it's a chance to play up. But like you said, if the criminals are able to move even faster than they already were, that might be a recipe for bad things to happen. Also, would look forward to unpacking what you're talking about, how we can make sure we have trust in what the private sector is doing with our data, what our employees are doing with our data. And one of the things we have been trying to advocate here is maybe we need either data trust or some other more transparent framework to make that happen. And so with that, I'd like to now turn to Daniela, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Daniela, if you could real quick introduce yourself. And I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is, what are some of these issues that cut across both communities and economies that we should be thinking about as we try to get through both this crisis and be more prepared for other types of disruptions too?
Thank you very much, David, and to my fellow panelists. And if you see me nodding my head, it's because everything that's been said so far resonates so deeply with me. I'm Daniela Tavo, and I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., and I'm a principal with Bold Tech Strategies, and I'm a corporate strategist who works primarily on issues that are complex, global, dealing with trade regulation and business operations across a number of sectors, including food and new technology. So much of what has been said, like I said, resonates. I mean, to me, the most fundamental issue that we're facing right now for communities and economies is a disparate understanding of science and risk, which often leads to bad choices and confusion. And as Philippe was saying, fear. So we may have different, societal values that lead us to different conclusions. But what we need to do is make sure that our methodologies for arriving at those conclusions are transparent, and they're similar based on similar circumstances, and they're communicated clearly to the public, because trust, to me, is a great antidote for fear. Mona talked about technology being a great equalizer, and I agree. I mean, one of the problems that we have right now is some of us have access and some of us don't, and that would help resolve a number of the issues that we have. I think in the context of what's going on right now, there's a lot of confusion around metrics for human health and even what constitutes economic health. And we're never going to completely stop these so-called experts and conspiracy theorists from piping out disinformation based on dubious methodologies, to me, which are akin to yelling fire in a movie theater. And still maintain our freedom of speech. I mean, one thing that we need to think about, and Lucas was talking about data, and I could not agree more, and the quality of data, but the more data that's out there, the less bandwidth people have, and they tend to cherry pick what they want from the data and draw their own conclusions. Again, you can't really stop them from doing that, but we need to be better and take a greater responsibility in enforcing and communicating standards around science and risk.
Wow. And so I'm going to actually ask you a real quick rejoinder before I go to Declan, because you hit the nail on the head that we do have this. In some respects, COVID-19 is probably the worst infodemic that we've seen. I know we had misinformation around what happened with 9/11, misinformation around what happened with even severe acute respiratory syndrome, that supposedly the US was doing it, which of course was clearly not the case. But this seems to be one of the worst ones. So maybe to unpack a little bit of what you're saying, I mean, what do we do when misinformation might actually be taken up by world leaders and they may be actually sharing it? Or what do we do when they are cherry picking their data and maybe not demonstrating what Mona said about making sure we're demonstrating good science and technological literacy? So Daniela, real quick, if you had a real quick rejoinder on that.
Well, we can't wait for the crisis to hit. That's the worst case scenario that we're waiting for. Now we have a pandemic, and for years we've been breeding mistrust and allowing it to happen. So we need to be more proactive in going out there and communicating. You know, I talk to a lot of scientists who will often say to me, it's actually in our training not to communicate. We need to resist that initial urge. And then once we're in that crisis, we need to recognize we're in the crisis. And first we need to build trust, and we need to build trust with our communities.
Excellent. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Declan, who is joining us from Brussels. Declan, real quick, if you could introduce yourself, and I'll ask you the same question I asked Daniela, which is, what are some of the issues that cut across both communities and economies here that we need to consider?
Thank you, David, and hello, fellow panelists. And well, I was just thinking that it's all been said, actually. Thank you all very much. So if I can, I'll try to add to that, and maybe picking up from Daniela's last point. I think this communication and in particular trust issues are huge. And we talk about these in cliches and in shibboleths, but just I'd like to point to the need globally for there to be, health data science capacity. At the moment, we don't have it. I mean, there is no system currently in the world which allows the exchange across many borders of biomolecular sample data. Doesn't happen. Yeah. So that ability, that functionality isn't there today. And as Lucas was talking about the GDPR, I remember at the early stages of the GDPR, Nobel laureates wrote to Nature magazine, and they said, "This is terrible. This is awful. End of science." Really, absolutely, they put their names to it and said, "This is really the end of science as we know it." And they sent it into the European Parliament. What happened? Nothing. Why? They didn't propose anything. Yeah, they just said, "We don't want this." They were not, and this is again coming to Daniela's point, is scientists are just very conservative in the way in what they do. And I think that's a fundamental problem. And certainly there's been a really cultural inability to engage with policymakers and policy making. And that really is an enormous challenge. But how do you do that at a global level? And we talk in conversations here today so far. I mean, our comments have been oriented around the developed world, but that's just a small part of the gig, What about everybody else? How does data exchange for better health work in Africa and all these other nations? I don't have the answer, but certainly it comes down to data exchange in one form or another, and that requires, as we've heard, proper reference data, proper categorization and curation of the data. That's absolutely vital. But how do you do it? And again, just to try to be positive, I think it has to happen through an integrated data infrastructure designed to do this. Yeah, in the case of biobanking. And another reason why I think we're hampered is because, again, in terms of, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but the thing of global governance, global governance for A, B, and C, but global governance for science, by and large, I would say it doesn't happen, hasn't happened. And one bit of evidence I would point to is, and I said this to the Secretary General of the UN within the last month, I said, "You're missing a trick. There's no science in the SDGs."
Right.
If you say you're going to improve healthcare outcomes, healthcare delivery, if you're going to do what you want to do with nutrition and food and water, and you don't mention or recognize the role and contribution of science to doing that, in my book, it's not going to happen. So I think the SDGs and maybe, hold underwater already because it doesn't do that. Yeah, it takes a very thematic approach to life. It doesn't deal directly with data at all, and it deals with very, very little science. But again, I stress, how do you do it is the critical aspect. But looking forward, I think we have new technologies, and I think while the GDPR in Europe and data protection legislation globally is a challenge, because now here we're off with the Senate publishing a paper recently, California having a paper, South Africa looking into it. Is that everybody kind of doing the wrong thing? And that's a road to disaster, really. But again, that has to be advanced in a society that recognizes trust and enables the cooperations and collaborations to deliver these innovations that are going to be terribly, terribly necessary for this COVID-19, for COVID-20, etc. So data systems are necessary.
Excellent. Thank you, Declan. As always, I know you can make sure you ask a provocative question. I'm going to really quick go to Philippe for a rejoinder, and then go to Lucas. Philippe, do you think that this is a case where we might be actually dealing with a society wanting zero risk and recognizing that if you want zero risk, you're really going to be held back? What are your thoughts there, Philippe?
Yeah, I was just thinking when Declan was talking about this. For me, there is also, it appears in the current discussion that perhaps there is some sort of blocking point somewhere in the crisis and in society in general, which is this forward looking for a society with zero risk. And so I think we've missed something very important. Nothing is at zero risk. Just looking to the tests today for the COVID, everybody knows for decades that none of the tests will be zero risk. So you will generate false positives, you will generate false negative, and nobody is sure at 100% to get a 100% test. So what appears in what Declan said is I think this is something underlying. We have some sort of hope somewhere in our brain that says we're going to reach a zero risk society. But the crisis today showed that it's impossible. And it is also part, I think, of this societal discussion we need to have. The fears are coming because we are unable to accept this non-zero risk.
Well said. And so now I'm going to turn to Lucas, because you talked a little bit about diving deeper into the mid and long-term solutions. Sort of what initiatives do you think should be amplified or that give you hope? And maybe what can we do to achieve both healthy communities and economic renewal here?
Thank you. Well, I mean, first of all, let me touch on something that Declan touched on a little bit here, which is this question of scientists being conservative. We've had two communities working on things and working on this. One is the public health community, and one has been the tech community. And you see some blindness in both of them, right? Where a lot of the apps that have been proposed by the tech community are frankly uninformed by what is actually efficacious from an epidemiological standpoint. And so, in fact, they do risk playing fast and loose with our data. On the other hand, having been involved in some of these hackathons and currently building a number of solutions, one of the frustrations we also run into is that scientists themselves, particularly those who work for public health authorities, are very conservative and basically will say, well, we're not sure that works, so we're going to hold off on trying right now. And in fact, bringing those together is probably what's going to get us somewhere interesting. I think instead of giving, one thing is the new initiatives that have popped up, but what we shouldn't forget are all the initiatives that we've actually had that have been working on these things in calmer circumstances for years and years. So for instance, I think about the work that the WHO has done on cross-border exchange of medical data, on developing a digital vaccine passport, this kind of stuff. Let's open up our drawers, find the stuff that was taking its time and accelerate it, because we've got the people on board, we've done the scoping, etc.
Very well said. And what I liked about what you said, because my own background was with public health and responding to bioterrorism and other outbreaks, and I find myself sometimes torn between skepticism about some of the, as we mentioned, there are false positives, false negatives, some of the contact tracing. If it gets to really large numbers, you're just going to have a percentage of bad data. But at the same time, I can also relate to my public health kindred colleagues who have been out there, and we get attacked by the media, things get taken out of context, and it really pains us. And so you're absolutely right. We need to bridge the communities of tech and public health and science to make this happen. So I'm going to go now to Mona, and Declan sort of said, we don't really have an international academies of science. It seems like every country doing its own, but clearly you're in a senior role, a true leadership role, advising top leadership on what they should do. So could you talk about some of the initiatives you think that should be amplified or give you hope that we can get through this crisis together?
The first thing I'll say is we've never talked so much about science in the public as we have now. So I hope that we're not going to have to wait for another crisis, and we need to continue the dialogue. So decision makers have been just like so great, saying, oh, we're doing what the science is telling us, and we're all awaiting the results of research to inform our next actions and so on. So I think that's something that we really need to amplify in terms of the connectivity and the connection between scientists and decision makers all across, I think, the countries and the globe. I think the notion of risk is also accompanied by sometimes the notion of perfection, which is a little bit surprising because usually in politics you're not really striving for perfection, and then suddenly in an emergency situation we need to be wanting to have the perfect app, the perfect data, the perfect drug, and so on. So I think that we're going to need to to come to grips to this trade-off and a little bit more of a risk taking, and readjust anyway our risk management or our risk grid, if you want, and just be willing collectively to look at what works in other places, adapt it to our environments, and really try to have a system where there's global connectivity and coordination anyway.
Excellent. And Mona, real quick, I like how you say how we have to be willing to learn, adapt. We recognize that we're all sort of going through this fog of war with the crisis. As you advise top leadership, how do you make sure that that advice is communicated in a way that doesn't, I mean, because you can imagine maybe like a political minority group might try to weaponize the narrative saying, well, you didn't get it right the first time. So could you talk a little bit about that real quick? And then I'm going to go to Lucas and then Philippe.
Well, I think that the notion of do no harm anyway has to be interpreted contextually. Do no harm these days is do nothing. That's a do no harm. So is this really what we want to do, or is it do harm by not doing anything? So it's, of course, it's difficult because as scientists we don't think about it this way, that another scientist is going to attack our scientific conclusion and so on. But in politics, I guess it takes on another level of attack, and it's the public. It's what is it that we're expecting of our politicians, and as we sort of maybe retool or do a reset, a collective reset, we should be asking ourselves, what is it that we are expecting from our leaders, both the ones who are in power and those who are in opposition.
Well said. So Lucas, real quick, you had a quick rejoinder that you wanted to share?
Just a quick reflection. When I hear these discussions on zero risk, it makes me think a lot about what has changed in the last 10 years in technology, where really we've gone from being deterministic to being probabilistic. And of course, machine learning is about probabilistic learning. So in a sense, the technology and all these discussions we've had for the last decade there have paved the path for having a less deterministic approach to these risk questions.
And that may point to, we need to have not just scientific and technological literacy, but also probabilistic literacy as well, when people want a deterministic answer. And the reality is we're doing the best we can to make sense of it. Philippe, a real quick rejoinder, and then I'm going to go to Daniela and dive in a little bit more.
A quick comment on what Mona just presented, so the role of the state. So what is striking, in fact, is that when you're looking to the Western democracies, which are more liberal than many other places in the world, we have seen a very centralized model operating, where the state and the public health administrations have tried to solve the issue without immediately mobilizing the private sector and their capacity to contribute to tackling the crisis. So it was extremely centralized. So the answer is, what we see now is that the answer is not always centralized, and that probably the best approaches in the future seem to combine the two. So I think we need in the future to find a good compromise between the reality of and speed of resolving the health economic crisis and the difficulty of a consensual decision-making by the state. This is, I think, something we are facing today. It's so immense that we're just facing this kind of relationships between the politician and the people.
And what you hit the nail on the head on with Philippe is that was already in some respects a growing tension between those countries that say don't separate their private sector from their public sector versus those that do. And now COVID-19 has really shined the light on how do you do that if you choose to have a free market, but also other types of governance. Daniela, you obviously work with industry, but you've also worked with government. So So what thoughts do you have, and what might be recommendations you have for leaders to bridge the two?
So it's a very interesting question, and you always ask me these interesting questions that I think are going to get me in hot water if I answer honestly. But so I'm going to preface this by saying, in my humble opinion, ... So there are two trends that I'm seeing right now that are bigger humanistic trends. Number one is about the private sector. The private sector has clearly become more and more consolidated in order to compete globally. And as they're doing that, and even though you're talking about businesses that are made up of people, they are increasingly disconnected from their community. And they don't necessarily understand. And when you don't understand what's going on in your community, it's very hard to think on your feet and be responsive and adaptive. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is about, and then I'll pull this all together, about the trend in technology. As we become exponentially, it's Moore's law, technologically advanced, you find more and more people who are specific experts in specific areas, but they've lost their broader worldview of how do you apply this technology? What does it mean? What are the implications? And I think the only way to really bridge that, and I think, David, you especially, given your background, are really good at this, and all of our panelists as well, is having that cross-pollination in our experiences to be able to understand. If you work in government your entire career, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand how industry works. If you work in industry your entire career, it's very difficult to understand what the obstacles are facing someone who's trying to figure out a solution, a government solution and a regulatory solution that addresses all of the legal implications and things, check boxes that they need to make. So I think the most important thing, and Mona was talking about adaptability, the people who are faring best right now, the businesses who are faring best right now are those that are adaptable and looking at the lay of the land with a fresh set of eyes and saying, okay, this is our new normal. How are we going to adapt to this? And the only way to do that is through forcing our own experience.
Wow, as always, I appreciate it. Thank you. And your humble opinion is actually quite enlightened. So thank you, Daniela, for sharing that. I'm going to go now to Declan and Mona. And Declan, sort of what Daniela was saying about how we bring industry and government together, you're clearly dealing with that in Brussels. What's your experience there?
My experience there is that it's hugely challenging for simple reasons. One is the industry perspective tends to be longer term, and then your average politician, his problem is either trying to get re-elected or whatever else. So, but that's a mishmash that we have, and I was going to raise that as a general point is in terms of, if you want to call it policy making, there's a lot of different cycles here. The COVID-19 is a now today. Industry investments and perspective is longer term. The needs of citizens are day by day as well, and governments are 4 years, and that's all that doesn't work at all in my view. And again, I think a fundamental issue that we need to appreciate is the COVID-19 context, of which there will be more. Clearly, it makes people very, very insecure, really insecure. And when people become insecure, as you've seen in the European Union, they become increasingly nationalistic. And that does all sorts of things to the policy makeup. And certainly if you're calling for broader perspectives, global initiatives, data regulation at a global level, blah, 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 this all butts up against homegrown problems, which increasingly we're experiencing. That's a fact. Which brings me to my key point is, how do we deal? Do we need to plan? And forgive me for the sound of this, but I believe it to be true. Post-democracy as we know it. Every state having a veto at the UN, or every state having a veto at the Europe level, whatever. Where is that getting us? And I think before this crisis, it wasn't getting us, terribly far as a general observation, although I would be a fan of the collective. But how then do you enable that, and how do you address these immediate homegrown challenges of people suffering on doorsteps, against the global perspective? And one example of the global perspective and what data can do on a positive note is that, of course, as you probably know, the vast majority, if not all, drugs consumed by women in the continent of Africa are designed on Welsh miners. The Welsh miners bit is Irish miners or whatever, but white males. Yeah. And clearly, you know, a juvenile could work out, well, that's not ideal. Yeah. But the only way this can be addressed is through this data scenario. There's no other way. You're not going to be able to build the patient cohorts of Black women in a whole range of diseases in Africa, or indeed in many other countries. Yeah. So I think there's huge opportunity there. But again, how do you get there? And that's going to require absolutely global governance. So maybe there's a global governance for the big data stuff, and there's local governments for bin collection. I don't know, but I think there's got to be demarcation, because I mean, I'm Irish, countries like Ireland. I mean, what's really the role in all this? You know, I can't see, and that's, with the greatest deference, I really can't see. And are a lot of these nations together, are they blockers, for bigger moves? Again, I think that needs to be looked at. So I think the post where we're here today now needs to be thought about. Yeah, and I think that's a system which goes beyond politicians trying to get elected every 4 years, and that's the model we've got, and it's dysfunctional increasingly. I think that's very, very clear, because these challenges are just evidently in your face, so different, so unforeseen, and relentlessly complex. Yeah. And if this stuff gets politicized, which very often it does, and we've seen the difference between device given in different environments, there is conflict. Yeah. So, and that results in bad decisions, unnecessary decisions, delayed decisions, or indeed wrong decisions. And I'm not saying anyone's going to have the perfect answer, but we've got to look at what does global look like and what does local look like.
Thank you, Declan. Well said as well. And real quick, Mona, before we sort of shift to another set of our discussions, Mona, clearly in Canada, it seems like Canada is doing fairly well and doing great well in terms of bridging what's going on with governments and industry. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and what you think are the hallmarks of success for Canada?
Well, it's very interesting, because it's the crisis, I think, has caused us to rethink our values and rethink our ways of doing things. And fast may not be the best attribute for governments. And at a time when, we have to move fast, I think this is where government has realized that they have things to bring to the table, but the private sector has things to bring to the table. And in our democracies and our social democracies, relying very much on the government as well to make sure that everybody has at least a safe net and a home and access to healthcare. Nonetheless, I think we've maybe realized that government's job is maybe to set the standards to of how we want the test to be done or health to be provided, and then bring on board the private sector, basically decentralize the implementation while maintaining the quality control. So I think that's that's interesting, and it's going to cause us, I believe, post COVID, maybe to have an interesting reset. And an interesting reset also in terms of, yes, we're all interconnected, but are our procurement values the right ones to basically protect us all, or to help our local economies and so on. So I think it's going to be very interesting, this post-COVID conversation.
Thank you for that, Mona. And I look forward to maybe there are things the U.S. could learn from what you're doing in Canada. So thank you for everything that you're doing in leading the way forward. Lucas, I'd like to go to you, and then Philippe. From an industry perspective, what would be the things that you would recommend that industry bring to public sector leaders to help us through this current crisis and future crises?
Sure, and I'll speak maybe from the perspective of smaller industry, if you will. I think we've had these very inspiring cases of new apps being come up with very quickly, big hackathons to kind of work them out. I think that the smaller companies can do is move agile and quickly in a way that big companies can't always, and put governments in a situation where they really have levers of action. However, I push back on the idea that industry can step in and solve all these problems, because if anything, this crisis has reminded us of the importance of state power, both to do good things and to do bad things. And most of the coordinated responses that have happened couldn't have happened without government sort of creating a space for them to happen. And I think that certainly you will see plenty of politicians pushing back on the most liberal ways of doing things. As for us specifically, I think what we're going to be focusing on is how we can make data more usable. I mean, that's just our company in particular. And I think that you'll have a lot of companies sort of who go through a lot of cycles on what they can do, new sort of sped up innovation cycles. And what we do hope is that government is open to those proposals and keeps their ear open to the kind of smaller companies that maybe are thinking outside of the box, in addition to talking to the Apples and the Googles and the Accentures of the world.
Excellent. And a little bit more on that, Lucas, in terms of, are there functions for either coalitions or alliances that could bring industry together? So it's not just individual companies speaking for themselves, but is there a way that industry could find a way to maybe come together, and so it's not just one group speaking, but it's actually a larger group?
So we have all sorts of consortia that you see on the COVID stuff. On the other hand, it's going to vary a lot by issue to issue. And I think right now, at least we're thinking more about now, what do we do with the economic aftermath and how do we do new things there? The problem, the easy answer is yes, but the problem always is that when you try and come together collectively as a group, especially if you've got companies that want to propose out of the box solutions, that will actually bring you down to a lowest common denominator. So I would juxtapose to the usual part about yes, let's cooperate, and yes, let's have compositions, which we anyway should do. Also a recognition that sometimes you do need, for the outside of the box idea to be present, you need to let people in who haven't built a box together.
Well said. And there's something to be said for diversity, including, like you said, those that are distant from the solution and may not already be in the field. So Philippe, similar question. What can industry do to help world leaders through this?
Okay, if I try to put together health and economy, I think, I don't know, but you probably know that many enterprises have what they call their social and environmental responsibility, and they have to show that they're tackling these issues. And I think we should add a new word on that, which is social, environmental, health responsibility. And I think we should revisit, I don't know how you say that exactly in English, it's labor doctor. We had that at the very beginning, at the end of, I think it started the early 20th century. We put in a responsibility in the companies to act as sanitary actors. And what we've seen in this crisis is that, as many of you have already said, is that it has been centralized to public health systems. And we have totally ignored liberal systems, liberal doctors. We have missed to use these labor doctors to tackle the crisis, to be sentinels, to be observatory of the propagation of the disease. And I think we have to revisit. And this is something that companies should do now. And I think I'm advocating for adding a new word to this responsibility, which is not only social, environmental, but also health.
Thank you, Philippe. So now I'm going to go to Declan, and I'm going to do a slight alignment of what Philippe was talking about, how we can move towards decentralized. And maybe if you apologize to moderator's privilege for being slightly self-interested, and say, let's say we have a nonprofit that works globally. It happens to maybe be called the Atlantic Council or not. It's up to you. But what could a nonprofit, what would you recommend that the nonprofit do to bring together both people from government as well as from industry? Declan?
Well, I think a focus area would, I'd put health as a priority there. I think there'd need to be a broad agreement on a terms of reference, and I think there's potential for having that as a data-driven objective. Then together, I think what could be done is really coming up with the enabling regulatory environment. I think that's, I'm not saying it's easy, but that has to happen. And secondly, then putting forward what I'm calling social solutions to see how then the outputs can be equitably accessed or distributed. So I think that's going to be hugely important. Whether it's the point I meant about drugs for women in Africa, or indeed other areas of health. And remember, before we were hit by COVID-19, I mean, there are huge health challenges, whether it's obesity or whether it's many of the other non-com diseases, and that has to be borne in mind. So this is really kind of a perfect storm. But the fundamental point I would highlight is the need to build this capacity. The capacity wasn't there when the storm hit. Now, and people have spoken about capacity historically, but I think now there's an acceptability at political level that yes, well, actually, we're going to have to invest in standing their capacity, and that is absolutely vital. But again, when we talk about governments, we're talking about all sorts of governments, aren't we? So it's not going to be easy. But I think the not-for-profit, and again, industry has to be part of the equation too. The role they can play is, I suppose, ironing out the wrinkles, providing a neutral forum. I think that's going to be absolutely vital, because without that, I don't see where it goes, really, because there's so much vested interest, there's so much opposition. And as a case in point, and as a backdrop to this discussion, and what will be a larger version of this discussion in the years forward, is the emerging cost of healthcare in the United States. It's almost 14% of GDP, and those, but that doesn't work anywhere else, you see. So how is it going to work? So I think huge challenges, but you can't avoid enabling the conversation, bringing the people together, having a common terms of reference, and building trust to do it. And I think that is simply put. Again, I'm not saying it's simple, but it's simply put.
And do this all in a context of increasing scientific literacy, technical literacy, with an eye to the long term. So we should be able to do it in about a week, right?
Maybe. But listen, the internet as we know it, I mean, is a huge driver and enabler for this. If we know which levers to pull, and again, with the advent of whether it's blockchain and AI, I mean, the cliche though it is, but the potential is endless there, but we have to figure out, well, what do we want as a society, what's needed, and how then that can be enabled, I suppose is a better term than delivered, because of the variety and variance that is going to be necessary in the pursuit of that objective.
All right, well, so now we are growing to a close. We're about 8 minutes out. We're going to go to the lightning round, and I'm going to go in the order of Lucas, and then Daniela, and then Declan, Mona, and Philippe. So you've got about 2 to 3 tweets that you want to sort of give a concise answer as to what would be the specific next steps you would recommend to world leaders to help us achieve both healthy communities and an economic renewal. So Lucas, if you want to go first.
Sure. Number 1 tweet is to use the data, but to make it auditable, verifiable, and controllable, both collectively and by the individual data subject. So anytime you've got a data protection conflict, actually err in favor of using the data, but putting the controls in place. Number 2 is that, yes, all this responsibility is good, but also let the private sector be the private sector. Short-term crisis responses have been not-for-profit. We, like many others, have done things for free, but medium-term and longer-term, we need to have economic growth, and some of that growth is going to be around doing things in the domain of health and managing the situation. Let companies make money off of this, allow the problem to be financialized. That will do 2 things. 1 is it will get the private sector juices flowing. 2, it will also help make a global response, because one aspect of a global response that we shouldn't forget that works is that because companies are global and they work globally, they can also socialize new technologies and new techniques internationally faster. Not necessarily always faster than academics can. Academics are good at this, but certainly faster than structured cooperation between governments can. So leverage those advantages of the private sector to do private sector-y things.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucas. All right, Daniela, similarly, 3 tweets. What would you recommend to world leaders?
First of all, don't wait for a crisis to build trust.
Right.
Not a good time to build trust. Second, I would say this actually for industry, since they also play a role in world leadership as global leaders. The best industries I know heat map. They don't just look at what they know, they try to figure out what they don't know and fill in the blanks before a crisis hits. And the third thing harkens back to something Declan said earlier about proposing solutions. As a strategist, I can tell you there are 20 different solutions to any other problem, but the solutions need to be feasible and the parts and components of the solution need to fit together. and work in conjunction with one another. So those are my 3 tweets.
Thank you. And what I like about that is, again, you're putting forward learn, adapt, recognize that really what we're talking about is the first attempt at iterative learning, and then doing a second and a third and a fourth from there.
Well, our crisis today is going to be different than our crisis tomorrow.
100%. And we'll know more tomorrow, too. Excellent. So Declan, your 3 tweets that you would recommend to world leaders.
I've got 2. First is increase the number of women in power and in science.
I think you get enthusiastic applause from everybody here.
I think that's a no-brainer. I'm not sure what the French equivalent for that is, but I think that's absolutely vital, because otherwise we're simply, as is the case now, we don't, as a society, understand problems sufficiently anyway. And I feel if the role of women, first of all, if there's gender balance, of course, and if the role of women is recognized and the contribution to decision making, indeed in all areas, I think it would make a fundamental difference to actually defining the problem, not about the solution, but defining the problem. And if defining the problem in a better way, I can't think of any other way of doing it, and there aren't any, then you have a better chance of producing better solutions. Then the second point is build capacity. Of course, I'd have bias towards the science stuff that I spoke and science capacity, and talking to, listening to Lucas's eloquent, definition of the data will then, have lots of, pipes to put it down, and so that the dissemination and use and exchange of data, there's a physical infrastructure for that. And I won't go into the different types of data, but one thing I would say that we need to recognize is the difference in feature between data which will be regulated, so personal sensitive data is regulated, and there's other sorts of data that are not regulated, so there's no clear demarcation yet, but I think we have to recognize that. So talking about data, but I think federated learning would suggest that we need to have demarcations between the regulated stuff and the non-regulated stuff in future at global level.
Thank you, Declan. And now, Mona, what would be 3 tweets that you'd like to recommend?
Well, let's see. The first one would be that we've learned the hard way, healthy economies require healthy populations. The second one would be to keep an eye on our knowledge gaps, and there are many of them. And the third one is to equip and empower communities so that they are part of the solution.
Wow, and those are both, one, extremely treatable, extremely concise. I can see why you are an advisor to world leaders. That was very poignant. So thank you, Mona, for that. And then Philippe, recognizing that Mona just raised the bar for you in terms of conciseness, can you bring it home for us, please?
Yeah, okay. I know Mona, so I'm not surprised. So I think we should. So the three points. I think we have to look for a new deal of trust using this New Deal economy that came in the only 1930. So how can we have a new deal of trust within all of us? I think this would be number one. And number two, which is related, is how can we put in place the foundations of a new economy of trust? So what are the bricks we need to use, or what the different flavors we have to put into what we could name an economy of trust? And finally, I think we need to foster multi-sector dialogue to remain agile. I think agility has been said several times during this discussion, and I think agility is something that is badly needed for solving this health issue, but it resonates also with many other issues like the climate change and the absurd use of resources all around the world.
Well said, Philippe. Well, I want to thank all our panelists. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Declan. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Lucas. The Atlantic Council is stronger thanks to your insights that you have shared. We are stronger together as we get through this. And I hope that world leaders will take away either from this video and the recap that we do, or from the advice that you are giving, because you are shining the light on how we get through not just this current crisis, but other future turbulence, and how we build a better, healthier, and more economically vibrant world together. With that, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who watched. Onwards and upwards together.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, David.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.